Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 14, describes the ascension of Jesus, that time when Jesus returns to the Father. This is the last time that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned in the Scriptures. Now, in this passage, we see her along with the brothers of Jesus continuing in fellowship with the disciples and other members of the early church. The Gospel of Luke tells us that the disciples returned from the Mount of Ascension with joy, unlike the first time that Jesus left them when their hearts were broken. Although they were sad to see him go, they were still joyful because the second departure was one of victory rather than defeat. It was one of glory rather than shame, exaltation rather than condemnation, power rather than weakness, and divinity rather than humanity. They had seen Jesus in his lowest hour, and because they loved him, they had to rejoice on the day of his ascension and exaltation, even though he was leaving them. Perhaps not too different, parents, than what you were just feeling a few moments ago when you were looking at those seniors and thinking about the road that lies ahead for them. Now, if the day of ascension meant much to the disciples, it must have meant more than words could explain to Mary, Jesus' mother. We often speak about the unsettling effect of Jesus' ministry upon his disciples and friends. To them, he was at times an enigma whom they never completely understood or quite figured out. We often talk about the devastating effect of the crucifixion of Jesus upon his disciples and friends without realizing that whatever they went through, the impact was even more confusing and painful for Mary, Jesus' mother. After all, they had only known Jesus for 3.5 years at most. Vessel. She was God's life within the body. Expecting in that first time that you felt the baby kick. Pregnancy, loving the life within, but not understanding exactly what happened to her or the nature of the role of the baby which she bore. It was Mary. Mary, who personally experienced the pain and joy of childbirth as her baby was brought forth in a very mean and crude circumstance in a stable behind an overcrowded inn in an overcrowded city where nobody seemed to take care or to take notice. She had been with Jesus at the very first moments of his earthly life. Now, those of you who are parents or caregivers, especially moms, know very well how suddenly life changes. Life's priorities change when you first hold a newborn. And so it is with Mary, guided not only by paternal instinct, but indeed charged by God with teaching and guiding and protecting his son. Imagine you are the caregiver of God's only begotten Son. Remember, friends, Mary was probably only a teenager. It was Mary. Mary who had been there when the shepherds came to see her baby, bringing strange reports about heavenly hosts proclaiming glad hosannas to the newborn Savior. She had been there when the gift-bearing wise men came from the east with a strange story of following an unusually bright star which had led them to the Holy Family. She had been both the shepherds and the wise men, seeing them bow down and worship her child. Now, she didn't understand the meaning of those events, but the scriptures tell us she pondered all of those things in a heart. Sometimes the meaning of life events are not immediately revealed to us. We must keep them stored in our hearts until a later time. We don't understand things as they always unfold. We don't understand the circumstances of life. Why this difficult moment in my life, Lord? Why this difficult time in my child's life? Perhaps in the same way that you held your firstborn in your arms and asked, whatever will become of this child? Think about Miles and what's yet to be. What's yet to be of that marvelous life, the promise and the possibilities. Only Mary could remember that day that she took the baby to be dedicated in the temple. Only Mary could remember Simeon. You remember Simeon, don't you? Simeon, desiring before his death to see the Messiah, glorified God as he laid his eyes on the child. Only Mary could remember how perplexed and startled she felt when Simeon told her that because of the role of her son would play in the redemption of Israel, that a sword would pierce her own heart and soul as well. She could remember. She could remember the initial pain from that sword when Joseph awoke her one night and told her to pack up their belongings quickly because they had to flee Egypt, for King Herod wanted to destroy their child. Only Mary could remember the fear in her heart as she and Joseph fled that night, and she wondered why anyone on the planet would want to destroy her precious baby. Carrie, if Ryan came home and told you something like that, I suspect you'd tell him, not here, not today, not ever, not this child. She could remember. She could remember the initial pain that the sword caused when all of a sudden she received word that they could go home. They could go home to the place that they had always known, and their excitement when they finally settled back down in Nazareth. Mary could remember the paternal anxiety, the time that they had gone to a feast in Jerusalem and assumed that Jesus was returning with some of the relatives, only to discover after traveling for a whole day that their son had been left in the city. Left in the city. Any of you have got 5 children and you take them to the mall and you put them all in the van and you get back in the van and you realize all of a sudden that 4 of them are in the van and one of them's in the mall, and you say, oh, that's all right, I've got 4 more at the house? She could remember. She could remember. She could remember the relief. The relief she and Joseph felt when she received word from heaven that child who they had been looking for was there. And she got to him and he was in the temple, and he said something that she just didn't imagine. When he turns to her and says, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I would be about my Father's business? Could you imagine your child turning to you and telling you that? There was this piercing in her heart. They'd been worried sick. Mary could remember with joy. Joy, those Nazareth days. As Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people, Mary had watched him mature into a man and take up the tools of carpentry, his earthly father's profession. However, she had not forgotten that visit from the shepherds, or the wise men in his infancy, nor his answer to her that day in the temple. And she knew that there would come a time when he would leave Nazareth. Mary tried to prepare herself for the inevitable. You know, you've been counting down the days until your child's getting ready to leave for college, go into the military. It's inevitable. But she would never forget the pain of that day when Jesus tenderly informed her that he had to leave home and pursue the calling that he felt within. Only a parent understands how Mary fought back tears, how she forced a smile as he stood in the cottage door saying goodbye to her oldest son, watching him walk down the road until he was out of sight. Only a parent. Only a parent knows how much she worried, how much she wondered what would happen to her child. Only a parent knows how hard she prayed that night and every night and morning thereafter that the God who gave him to her would watch over her child, would protect him from hurt and harm and danger. Mary could remember when she began to receive mixed reports about her son's ministry. Some said that he did mighty works for God, while others said he was crazy. She could remember how upset the neighbors and friends and relatives had been when he returned to Nazareth in an attempt to do there what he had done elsewhere. She could remember the pain and sorrow in his eyes when his message and ministry had been rejected. She could remember how he looked at her when he said, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country and amongst his own kin and in his own house." Do you remember what disappointment looks like on the face of your child? Jesus left Nazareth. She continued to fear that the worst might be true, that her son was being driven by some evil spirit which was not of this world. So with one of his brothers, she sought him out that she might bring him home for a much-needed rest. She was, however, to learn the painful lesson that when God is working with a person, not even the nearest and the dearest kin have the right to interfere. Carla, you remember when Terry came and started talking about ministry? You know, this is not what we had planned. So, there it was. Not what she thought. She had to go after her child, and she had to learn that hard lesson. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, nor scorn his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. Well, there was that day when she received the news that Jesus had been arrested in Jerusalem, would probably be put to death, as might any mother with a child in danger. She left home immediately in order to be near her son. No matter what the world said about him, he was still her son. Irrespective of what he had or had not done, he was still her son. Whether or not he was possessed by a spirit of God or an evil spirit, whether he was in his right mind or not, he was still her son. Although he was a condemned criminal, and despite the disgrace and shame of the crucifixion, he was still her son. She saw him struggle under the weight of the cross. She saw him stumble and fall. How she wanted to run to him to lift that cross off his shoulders, but she couldn't, because he had to bear his own cross. How many times have you wanted to rescue your child, your teenager, your grown child facing addiction? How many times would you just do anything, just anything, to make it better? But each of us must bear our own crosses, experience our own pain. Every lash that Jesus received was a lash across Mary's heart. Every blow of the hammer that drove the nails deeper into his hands and feet, she felt it. Because this was not some misguided prophet, not just some suffering mass of humanity. This was bone of her bone and flesh of her flesh. Maybe that's why she stood near that cross. Others might sit and watch with complacency. Others might curse him and mock and laugh. Others might hide their face in shame and stand far off. But Mary was bold enough to stand near the cross where her son, her little boy, her growing teenager, her young man was dying. She had been with him at the beginning. She would be with him at the end. When he hung his head and died, a part of her spirit died with him. Others may have had their grief, but hers was a special grief. Hers was a mother's grief. It was the grief of one who had carried him in her womb, gone through the travail of birth, nursed him, cared for him, taught him, guided him, one who had prayed a mother's prayer for him. So when Jesus ascended into heaven, Mary had a special joy. No one had been with him as long as she had. No one had prayed for him like she had. No human had loved him as long or suffered as she had. Mother's Day for Mary was Ascension Day. On that day, the plan of salvation that had begun over 33 years before, when the angel Gabriel had visited her, was brought to a glorious finale. Jesus was now ascended, exalted, the reigning Lord of all nations, the conqueror of every foe, the fairest of 10,000. What must it be like to see your child with all of their dreams coming true? To recognize that you've played a role in shaping and forming a life. My friends, that's what God does for each of us. God claims us as God's own, shapes us and forms us in God's own image, redeems us, looks at us in the midst of our brokenness and says, I love you in spite of it all. In your worst moments, I love you. I claim you. Knowing the worst that there is to know about you, I gave my only begotten Son, who stretched wide his arms and died upon a cross, that we might know the full measure of life. You call yourself New Beginnings United Methodist Church, and you are right. For this is a place of new beginnings for many who come to experience the fullness of Christ's love and redemption. On this day, as we celebrate the baptism of Miles, on this day, as we celebrate new places in the journey for those high school graduates, on this day when we acknowledge and give thanks to God for the blessings of women and mothers and sisters and aunts who have shaped us and formed us, be mindful that that precious gift is simply a reminder of the God of heaven who loves us and creates us anew in the waters of baptism. Beloved, that is the good news of the gospel. And it is God's gift to you, each and every one of us. So perhaps you thought you were here this morning because this is what you do on Sunday mornings. But my friends, you are here by divine appointment, not of your own choosing, but because you've heard the voice of God speaking to you. Maybe today you want to give a life that counts. If you want to give your mother a gift, give a life that has been blessed by God, given back to God in full measure. So maybe today you need to make a first-time commitment to Jesus Christ because you've never done that before. Or maybe you've made a commitment to Christ, but somewhere along the way, the relationship grew cold and distant, and you want to come home again. Or maybe today you just want to stand in the gap and pray for that person in your family, for that graduate, or for that person who's in the hospital, or the person who's facing addiction, or the person who's behind prison walls. This morning, as the praise team leads us in song, the chancel rail is open. If you need to come and to entrust your life and your care to God's care and keeping, then come and allow God's grace to meet you here with no shame and no judgment, but to be wrapped in the love of Christ in the same way that we're wrapping those graduates in those blankets, to remind them that there is a God of love. Come. Come. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.